Welcome to Tim Stodd's FM.
We're recording. What's up, Quinn?
Not much, man. Not much. Trying to get my life juice going. I'm a recent convert, I guess you could say, to caffeine.
Are you serious? I'm team caffeine all the way. I do not understand when people are like, the worst thing you can do is drink coffee in the morning. Well, especially because I'm sober, right? So I don't have cigarettes. I got nothing. I don't even drink soda anymore. I got coffee, and it's like, if anybody tries to fuck with my morning coffee, there's a big problem.
No, I get it. I mean, my wife's heart doesn't start beating until she has her first cup. It doesn't matter if like house is on fire, children are on fire. She's making her way to the Nespresso machine. No, I just, I feel very lucky that I've never needed it, which is nice. In the sense that, well, one, since I never really drank it, I never needed, like, had a dependency, but also I think it's because I swam and played baseball in college. And so
mornings,
my alarm clock from age 12 to 22 went off at 4:20 and I was in the water at 5. And so I've just kind of, not that was enjoyable, but that's just kind of how I've always been programmed. So I guess I've never needed it, but I have discovered, kind of, like you, I live fairly cleanly these days for a number of reasons, mostly small children and work. But I try to use it as like a performance enhancing drug, essentially, which is because I do it not seldom, but not very regularly, I can pretty predictably know how it's going to affect me. And so I'll try to utilize it in that way, if that makes sense, for some deep work or whatever it might be. But it's lovely. I enjoy it. I'll drink decaf all the time. My wife's like, "You're disgusting. It's wrong. What's the point?" I'm like, "No, I love the ritual and it tastes delicious. I just I can't do it she can do it at 9 o'clock at night and then wave goodnight." I'm just like, what? It's crazy.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
I'm the same way. I didn't know you were a swimmer. My sister is actually a Pennsylvania state champ swimmer, so I'm well versed.
Nice.
The
so you were part of that life?
Yeah, swimmers are crazy. It's swimmers and wrestlers. A lot of people think that, like, I don't know, the football players are the toughest ones. No way. The swimmers and the wrestlers are by far the most mentally strong athletes out of all of them.
I played all the sports, man. I did football. I was a quarterback. I did the whole thing. Like, of course it's hard. Like, but swimming is ridiculous.
It's hard.
It's the longest season. It's 7 hours a day. It's training so that you can lose a race by 100th of a second once a year.
I know.
It's something else, man. But it's also the greatest thing. I mean, you learn just an incredible amount of discipline, how much the little things matter. Yep. I mean, I was a sprinter, so the difference between
the flick,
if you hit the wall like this versus like this,
yep.
I mean, that's it. Which can really add up into a lot of therapy bills eventually. But no, it's great, man. I'm very thankful for it. It's good.
That's really cool. Well, great. I'm so excited to talk to you. I've been following your brand for a while. You and I met virtually through, what was it?
Yeah.
That hustle.
Yeah, that's right. The hustle thing.
Yeah, and that was fun. So, all right, let's get to it. I start my podcast with the same question every time. The background picture to your Twitter bio. Tell me what it means to you.
The my photo or the background thing?
The background image.
Shit, now I got to see what the hell it is. Hold on. What is it? Oh, okay. So that's from, it's not my side business anymore. So I've got this, I've got 2 full-time jobs. Well, besides being a dad and a husband. My first job, which I've been doing for about 7 years, is I'm a screenwriter. And that kind of led to my second job, which is this media company. It's a newsletter and a podcast primarily called Important, Not Important, as we call it, science for people who give a shit. Yeah. But the original tagline was what's on this background, which says the conversations most vital to our survival as a species, which is supposed to be fairly tongue-in-cheek, but also, it's not great outside. And that was before we all got locked inside. And yeah, I guess I've just kind of kept it there, which is interesting. But we still use it. It's on t-shirts and stuff like that. It's, I guess I should explain what it is first. Would you like me to do that? Would that be easier?
Oh, yeah.
So my day job has been screenwriter for a while. I started my career as at the Financial Times. I worked for ESPN for a while. I did a bunch of startup advising, investing, things like that, digital, clean food, clean tech, things like that. And then as I was writing, I write not primarily, but a lot of sci-fi and tech and science and things like that. It's kind of what I came up and loved. And so I have always made a habit of following what's the newest in science and technology and medicine and space and all that kind of stuff. And I realized a few years ago, because I was so proactive about that, seeing a lot of news that was really good and really not so good on the science front, that a lot of folks that both I care about, but also are inclined to care about those things weren't seeing. And I think it was primarily because they were getting their news from things like Facebook, which turned out to be a disaster. But I just eventually was like, hey, I'm going to just throw together this little newsletter. I mean, just literally copy and pasted some things with some pull quotes. Here's the 5 or 10 like big things you missed this week. They're really good. They're really not so good. Send it out to some family and friends. It was basically an effort to stop them from yelling at me because I would just send article after article after article, which drives everybody crazy, which I get. This was a way to consolidate it. And it was good. And I frankly, really didn't do that much with it for quite a while. And then it became a little more of a focus as more people got interested and friends and family forwarded on. And I tried to clean it up and make it look, I wouldn't say professional, but a little more like I was trying. And it eventually is continued evolving, I hope, in a positive way. And it seems to be received that way, in a way that is got a little more of my voice in it. It's more of it's not just, as much as my wife is so wonderful and such a big supporter. She goes, oh, he's got a climate change podcast. Super helpful. It's not just climate change. It's probably 30-40% specifically that, but obviously it touches so many things. But it's, the easy ways, it's all the scientific things that are going on that are also part of society and that could either just wipe us all out in the next 10 years or make everything a lot better, right? So it's climate change and clean energy, it's cancer, it's COVID, it's antibiotics, it's biotech, it's artificial intelligence, things like that. It's the real stuff that's happening now. And it evolved into, hey, here are the sort of the big news for each of those categories, but also here's some real like generalist analysis, thinking about not just what is happening, but how to think about those things individually and taken together, because with everything changing so quickly all the time now, as we've all learned, science is, while it's always been part of our everyday lives since the Enlightenment, for better or worse, it is obviously much more specifically linked. We all follow 10 epidemiologists on Twitter now. It has become a way to really try to help people think about how to think about these things, how to take them in, how to process them, how to act on them if they need to. And that's sort of been our last piece of the bread and butter, is these action steps, as we call. We take really data-driven, specific, reputable action steps I spend a lot of time on and I verify with a lot of folks, so that you can take action on those specific things that are happening. Because a lot of these things, sea level rise, whatever it might be, can feel fairly existential and seemingly like something that you could not affect. But you can, and there's a portfolio of ways you can do that, from individual actions to grander systemic things. And so that kind of took off. And then the whole conversations most vital to our survival as a species came about because we started to send this thing out weekly. It started to really take off. And I had a few friends who were like, great, I feel a little more up to speed. I feel like I'm starting to get, because a lot of these things, it's not like, there's not news that like sea level rise just happened this week. It's updates on how we understand it. It's these macro trends. It's things like that, newer reporting or journals or whatever it might be. And so folks would say, I'm getting it now. I feel like I'm more up to speed. I'm starting to understand how these currents are affecting my life or my elected officials or my business, my investments, my industry, whatever it might be. But I would like to understand this specific thing a lot more. Can you do that? And I was like, well, here's the thing. And I've always tried to be very transparent. I'm a liberal arts major. I'm like a pagan atheist religion major who also studied sociology and anthropology.
Cool.
And my classes were like 8 people and you couldn't hide. So it was a lot of question asking, right? And trying to understand first principles and trying to understand why people do what they do, individually and on a societal level or in a group containment level. And so I was like, I'm not a scientist. I've worked for newspapers and the media, but I'm not a journalist. I'm not an engineer, not a doctor. I'm not building wind turbines. But in a generalist way, again, I spend most of my week talking to those folks. And so I said, okay, well, let's make a podcast that complements a newsletter. It's not just more of a wrap up. It's a conversation about one really specific thing that's pulled from this moment, pulled from the news. And we bring on a really incredible, far more capable human than I could ever be to educate me and us on it. I have a wonderful co-host, a buddy, Brian, give us context for it. And then again, our bread and butter, we try to build towards these action steps that folks can take to support that person's mission, to support or fight against something. Because again, if you're driving in your car, when people used to drive around in their cars, and you're listening to people talk about climate change, for example, for an hour, it's real easy for that to get sad real fast.
Yeah.
And then you just kind of want to close your eyes and drift into traffic and whatever happens, happens. But science and research tells us, if you are able to take action on something, it floods your brain with all these wonderful chemicals and you can see a tangible result. And eventually those things can add up into something bigger, right? And so we try to give you not just call your congressperson or donate to a charity, donate to this specific place because this is what they're doing. Here's the URL. This is how far your dollar will go. We've run it up against people who vet these things, Charity Navigator, GiveWell, whatever it might be. Or don't just call your congressperson, call this specific number about this specific piece of legislation and why, and here's what it'll do. So we both want to give people the context and understand why they're doing something, but then give them the what so that they feel like they're taking this effective action. And if we're asking them to spend their money or to use some time, which is more valuable than money, that they feel like they're doing that in a way that, you know, it's a trustworthy source, that it's going to do something as far as things can go. So that's where it kind of came from, the conversations most vital to our survival as a species. The species is going to be fine no matter what happens, but it could get even darker out there, and a lot of folks are already suffering. At the same time, we're on the cusp of some truly incredible things, you know? And it's important to recognize those as well and try to support those as well. So that's where my Twitter background pick comes from. That's a good one. Have you heard what I lead my podcast with? It's preposterous. And it goes with that. And one question I asked everybody is, why are you vital to the survival of the species? And keep in mind, I talk to like the smartest people on the planet, and most of them start off by laughing at me. And then I'm like, look, you're here for a reason. Be bold, be honest. And eventually you get this really awesome answer from them. And it's usually like, I'm not, but here's why my work is, and here's what I hope to do with it. And eventually I'll get my act together and make sort of a composition, because we've done 110 of these or whatever, because it's just these wonderful things of people trying to find their way into this and make an impact, and they're incredible, and why they do what they do. And it's a fun way to start off. So I like yours. That was great.
Thanks, man. It takes a lot of the pressure off of me to think about like what to do. And
it's so much better than like, where are you from?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm so glad that you brought up those action steps. It's probably my favorite thing about the content that you put out there, because I agree. As a scientist, you look at I'm not a scientist. As a scientific minded person, you look at these carbon emission charts and the fucking thing's just parabolic, and you're like, the end of the world is coming. There's nothing we can do. We got another 300 years. I might as well just be as happy as I can be. Right. But those real simple. So in the same respect, I guess I would consider myself an individualist, if that's a thing. I think that in almost every case, the solution to big problems is every single person trying to solve it for themselves. Like I really believe in, I think it was Mother Teresa, if everybody swept their front porch, the whole world would be clean, something like that. And so I remember it was probably about a year ago, I listened to one of the podcasts you had about antibiotics. And antibiotics I find really, really fascinating, just how blindly we pop antibiotics without actually thinking about the fact that these germs, well, viruses in particular, they're the most like quickly evolving things in the history of the world. That's why they run shit the way that they do. And so I remember going to the doctor one time. It's just a cold. And he prescribed me a Z-Pack. I was like, no, I don't need that. And he goes like, but this is what you take to feel better. And I'm just like, I'm going to be fine. I'm not going to die. And in the long run, like when I'm actually sick, an antibiotic will work as opposed to just building up immunities to these super germs. So that's just one example. I'm not necessarily trying to veer the conversation into antibiotics, although I welcome it if that's hot on your mind right now. But for me, living my life in a way where I know I have the like critical thinking skills in part of these action steps that I've chosen to take in my life, where it's like, okay, do I actually need to pop a Z-Pack? And is that making the world a better place? And most of the time the answer is no. And I just really believe that if you do that, 300 million times across the country, in 10 years, this kind of thinking might start to come up. And then, 50 years from now, we won't have a super virus that just fucking, because that stuff is real. We talk about it in science fiction, but like
Clearly.
Viruses aren't, like it's not like a fake thing that we talk about. They are real things. They really make people sick. So that one small example, I believe, is a good representation of what the action steps that you're taking are.
Oh, I appreciate it, man. I mean, look, yeah, it's antibiotics is one of those things. So, antibiotics affect bacteria-driven infections. They don't, that's one of the confusing things. It doesn't work with viruses specifically,
bacteria.
Right? And that's one of the issues is, when COVID started, a bunch of people went in and said, like, I want Z-Pack or whatever, and doctors were prescribing.
Yeah, I misspoke.
Totally fine. There's enough going on. This is the point. It's impossible to fucking keep track of all this stuff. Yeah. Excuse my F-bomb. And it's really hard when most medical professionals who are well-meaning are trying to help you feel better, And so you go in and you trust them, and most of the time they can be trusted. But at the same time, we have messed this place up in 1,000 ways in such a short period of time, like relatively, where it's like we get the Industrial Revolution and we start building a lot of stuff. And the environment was pretty okay before that, relatively. And then, look at the difference. The biggest difference between World War I and World War II is penicillin, right? You can take all the machinery out of it, but that is the biggest difference why we stopped having to saw everybody's legs off when they got, a bullet in the ankle. It makes a difference, but the problem is we as a species suck these things up and go, great, and then we just use them as much as we can, whenever we can, just like we have with trees and water and land and whatever it might be. So they're amazing, but then, yes, there's really big things happening, but there's also research that needs to be brought to the front, and news where you see things like, hey, listen, the antibiotic, I think it's amoxicillin, that we traditionally use for strep throat really isn't working as well as it has in the past. And that is going to have secondary effects and become something else besides the fact that strep throat just sucks. And some kids really suffer from it, chronically. These are problems that we create that eventually become much bigger things. And then all of a sudden the seas are rising, So I try to look at those and not just like pick obscure things out, but go like, hey, listen, like you were saying, like this is part of your everyday life. You can make a decision on this, but also because, so for instance, one of the things we get, and sorry to sort of bounce around on this, but, we'll get questions a lot from folks going, it's usually two questions about the action steps. One is, you've supplied the same action step twice this month, right? Or this action step isn't the one that's going to like really move the needle. It needs to be X.
Yeah.
And my answer to both is, if we're repeating it, it's because it's something that's really actually going to move the needle. And two, you might not see the big systemic one every time, because what I've tried to do over time is help you build, and we're working on tools to do this. When I say we, it's me and my rescue dog. Build essentially your portfolio of actions of things you care about. Because for so many of these systemic issues, whether it's climate change or antibiotics or COVID, we really have to throw the kitchen sink at these things. And so it requires you not only sweeping off your porch, but going around to your neighbors and helping them understand why it's important for us all to sweep off our porch.
Yeah.
And then also talking to your local officials, your city councils or your school boards, and helping them understand why it's important for their messaging and maybe their legislation or the way they conduct their businesses, for businesses to sweep off their porches because it benefits X and Y and Z. And then taking that further, because if we don't do the full scope, then it's not going to change. But at the same time, we have to understand, I mean, there's this term greenwashing that's out there, which is essentially, I mean, it's fossil fuel companies, you know, pretending that they're doing better than they are, that they're the answer to the problem. They're the problem. But they've also done this thing for 60 years where they make you feel like the problem is your fault. And in some ways, you can look at it superficially and go like, sure, I am the one who used that energy. I guess it was my fault. But at the same time, you didn't have a choice when we could have had a choice all along. And so it's important to look at it and go, these are forces that are acting upon me and upon all of us all the time. And so what is the most effective way for us to fight back? Yeah. It's for you to get solar panels, sure, but we are a tribal species. Your neighbor is going to look at those and knock on your door and go like,
yep,
where'd you get the solar panels? What's the deal? Are you saving money? Are they effective? Do you have the same power? It starts a conversation that continues on. And these things can, don't always turn into marching in the streets, can turn into elected officials or candidates for office going, you got to listen to the people. You know, they've got this on their mind and these are the actions they're taking. We need to do our part to formalize that so that it makes a bigger systemic impact to make sure these companies can't do that sort of thing. So yeah, I am a believer in individual actions, but at some point, you know, because these problems are so big, those need to be focused in a way that it'll eventually turn into regulation if it's necessary, or incentives if it's necessary, whatever it might be, to really move the bigger needle of things. But it's got to start from the bottom, you know, it has to.
Okay, there's two things I want to go to here, and you actually just touched on it with that last sentence, which is I go back and forth in my mind a lot as to what the solution to these things are. Is it open markets, whereas people are just incentivized to make better decisions that will help? I mean, clean energy is the easy one, right? If you make clean energy cheaper than fossil fuels, everybody's going to use clean energy. So that's one option. Or is it more of like I hate to use the S word, but more of like a socialistic government legislation route where like we have to force these decisions on companies who clearly, if given the option, are just going to do what's most beneficial for them, right? I sometimes I look at it and I say like, yes, clearly the answer is free markets. Make the option better for people somehow. And it's pretty clear that I think wind is cheaper than fossil fuels. It's just pushing the electricity to them is a little bit more difficult. Or do you just say like, hey, all you companies need to stop doing what the fuck you're doing. Here's the legislation that we wrote, stamp it. There's two ways to go. The answer is probably a combination of both, right? If we're being realistic. But if there is one route that you think is more of a direct path to living life with more sustainable and symbiotic energy, which route do you think we got to go?
Yeah, it's both a simple and a complicated question, and you've got some, you know, great thoughts about that. And it's great when people are wrestling with it. You know, it's hard when people go like, "This is the way."
Yeah.
The problem with folks who are inherently devoted to the free market way is that has basically been the bulk of the way for the past 45 years or so, at least in the United States federally. And everything is on fire and the seas are rising. So on that front, the receipts are a little bit in as far as how well that has worked. Not to say there hasn't.
Sounds great, but this is what's happened so far.
Everybody's locked in their living room. It's not great, you know? That's not to say there isn't a place for it, of course. I mean, we're never going to be able to separate the fact that a corporation as an entity its purpose is to provide value and profit to its shareholders, right? That is why they exist, right? Especially public corporations. We can't get rid of that sort of fundamental first principle. That would be a different conversation, and that's where you go into a country or society that is much more explicitly founded on more socialist principles, and there's room for that. There's no perfect system to this thing, right? It's a great Winston Churchill quote, I think. It's like democracy I can't remember what it is. It's like democracy is only great because nothing else is any good, whatever it might be. But so you've got that, which is a bunch of corporations in a free market, predominantly led by white men in a system designed by white men, has not fared well for everyone. And the folks that predominantly are not involved or not stakeholders or definitely not leading those companies are the ones that are suffering first and most. Yeah. So we have to go, okay, are we talking about, is individual liberty really the thing that matters the most here in profits, or is it the societal good and this contract that we sort of have with each other? And this is something that America is always going to wrestle with just because of America and United States. But there's also ways to look at these things and go, okay, so if this is the immovable pieces, then how do we put regulation in and make transparent reporting standards that acknowledge all the externalities that are out there, so that these companies can exist and be profitable and be successful, but also contribute in a much more practical and transparent way to the greater good. And that's where
I'm so sorry, let me interrupt there, but you hit on externalities, which I think is something that is so freaking important. It's not actually what you build. It's not the cost of what you build. It's the cost of the byproduct of what it takes to build the thing. So like almond farming is such a simple example. If the almond farmers were actually in charge of paying for the externality, which is like the sinking land in California, because creating one tiny almond uses a gallon of water, which blows my mind every time I think about it, then the free market of almond farming wouldn't exist, because if the almond farmers are in charge of paying for the externalities that their product creates, there's no market for it. So,
and that's the thing about the free market thing, is if this thing was a level playing field, they would be blown out of the water, but it's not. And that's like, we've subsidized fossil fuels to trillions of dollars over the past however long. We do it every year still. So when they're just like, let the market ride it out, it's like, but it hasn't. And that's the thing, is because you've been cheating basically the entire time.
It's like jerry-rigged in a way.
Yeah, for sure. And again, not only have you gotten these subsidies, but again, you haven't had to pay for the externalities whatsoever. And that is an increasing thing. And that's how, so when we start to talk about, okay, so if corporations are still going to exist and still going to do their thing, how do we make them part of this greater good and make them responsible for it in a positive, and for their purpose, I guess, a negative way, which is started with ESG, which kind of doesn't really mean much. And you can see, like, if Exxon has 5 women on their board, they might qualify for ESG, whatever that might mean, but they're still like destroying the planet. So that has to get stricter. And you're starting to see that, not surprisingly, in Europe more, where they're starting to enact these standards that everyone's still trying to figure out, that are much more transparent, and they go into insurance, and they go into financing, and they go into all these pieces, so that it's more apples to apples along the way. And that's where you're going to start to see both the stick, which at this point is just necessary, and you're also going to see some carrots, which is, guess what? If you can turn your company around, or you can start a new company, or you can reinvent yourselves to be more progressive, to take responsibility, like you said, the byproducts, which the technical term for a lot of that is scope 3 emissions. It's what do your users do with your product? And you can't ignore that. You have to be responsible for that. We don't want to a lot of times, because corporations like to ignore the social contract part, which is like, what people do with their stuff is their choice. That's not on us. But at this point, it has to be. And that's where you see companies like IKEA going, ESG is kind of whatever it is, and there's these new standards coming, but we recognize that not only are we responsible for scope 1, which is like, what is the power our company uses? Can we buy solar power? Great. Or tech companies do with data centers. That's great. I'm glad it's solar. But for instance, IKEA and Apple and Walmart, which are probably the 3 biggest ones to both take this on and responsible for it, are going, okay, we're going to actually try to tackle our scope 3 stuff, which is the manufacturers and the assemblers and the power they're using, and where do the products come from, who's making those products, who's shipping them, who is packaging them, what is the packaging like, and then how is it being used? Are they being recycled? Are they being reused? And that is, I mean, I don't envy these companies. Like,
it's hard.
You got to build and build and build without having to think about that. And now someone's going, now you have to, because we're fucked. That's a hard one, but we need them to do it. And the carrot is, if you do it, you'll actually probably become more profitable in the long run, because a lot of these guys aren't going to be able to do it, or they're not going to try, and they're out, man. So, and then also, by the way, again, people will look at you and go, thank you for doing the right thing. I'll buy more of your products. And you know, it's going to prove itself out. It's going to be ugly. Like, this transformation and transition, we need it to be much more just for a lot of the folks who are already suffering because of what essentially white men have been able to do for 400 years. But at the same time, you know, we have to properly design this thing for the externalities that are already happening, but also looking forward to the future and going, how can these companies still exist and profit and succeed? But we have to be candid about what we know, and what we know may be coming down the road, or else game's up, man. You know, it's going to be rough. There's a great quote. There's a science writer for The Atlantic named Ed Yong, who's incredible. He's written a couple books. He's working on another one. He came sort of out of his sabbatical this year to write a lot about COVID. And he had this great quote, which is essentially, COVID is this flood that exposed all the cracks that already existed in our design. Yeah. And it's true, you know, it exposed the choices we've made about pre-existing conditions in healthcare and supply chains. And I know you do a ton of work in healthcare, and it's that, like, we thought we were ready, and in fact, we were entirely unprepared for these things, or we had dug holes that have been entirely, you know, taken advantage of by a virus that everyone is susceptible to. And so now it's awful. What's happened is just terrible. And a lot of it was preventable, but now we get to look at those and go, these are the real problems, and we have to fix these things, from supply chains to public health. So there's an opportunity there.
Yeah. Okay. You said opportunity there. I try my best where every time I went through a phase where I honestly just couldn't, and I'm kind of ashamed to say it, because I like to think of myself as like a realist. And if I see a problem, the best thing to do is address it, right? But I really went through a phase where there was just so much coming at me. I had to not look at it and kind of bury my head in the sand. And, you know, eventually I like mustered up the courage. It happened. I go to a float tank once a week. I don't know if you ever do that, like a meditation thing. And
I haven't, but it sounds amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, anywhere where my kids aren't asking me for snacks. Like,
yeah. And so I had, every once in a while, you get like a real good realization in one of those things. And I had that realization of just like, look, this is the reality. Not facing it isn't going to change how it affects you. So I might as well learn about it. And one of the, as I started really diving in, I became half afraid and half optimistic, because there still is this. So let me get specific for a second. When you talk, there were two things that really came out. There was energy and there was food. And I read somewhere, and I think it was Elon Musk who put the science together. So I'm always a little bit like skeptical as to whether he's like pitching his company or if it's actual science, but it seemed pretty legit, where we could build like a 3-by-3 mile solar farm in Nevada in the middle of the desert and basically power the whole country. And so I'm thinking to myself, like, this is so stupid. If the solution's right there, then what's the issue? So there's the power problem. And then the food problem is something that we obviously realize, because we need food all the time, but how food is created in the country, and the topsoil that we get rid of, and the land that we have to flatten, basically, which, you know, causes other secondary and third problems, where like you lose the trees, you lose the carbon recycling, and then the flat land bounces the photons off the earth, which then, you know, it's like a big cyclical cycle, a big cyclical problem, excuse me. So what I'm getting at is, I read all of these problems, and then I started reading these amazing solutions where it's like, okay, the food problem can be solved pretty quickly with some of the indoor farming. And there's actually a company I looked at in Kentucky, which is doing some amazing stuff. And then the power problem, it's not that hard. Like, it seems pretty realistic that we can power the entire country through solar. So what are some of the actual solutions that aren't just feel good stories that people are working on where it seems like we can do this and this is good?
Yeah, I mean, this is like one of my wife's like both favorite and least favorite things about this role in my life, which is I get to kind of be the bummer in any conversation, whatever it might be. But look, these things are, we are lucky that they are within our capabilities for the most part, for the first time ever, really.
Yeah.
Look, we could have had solar a long time ago. We could have really had wind. We could have had electric cars a long time ago. Food doesn't need to be this issue, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, the American healthcare system and health insurance doesn't need to be this way. It could have been easier. All these people didn't need to have these pre-existing conditions, but we gave them junk food and we made them live next to fossil fuel refineries, et cetera, et cetera. They're very doable.
Yeah.
And we're very lucky to have things like for climate, the Drawdown organization, they've done a tremendous job really quantifying this stuff and looking at the best ways we can do these things. Drawdown, it's fantastic. Can't recommend it enough. It can really help you understand, and some of it's really surprising in a wonderful way of what the most effective things are, is explicitly focused on reducing emissions. And that's a whole other conversation we can have about this net zero stuff. But the number one thing we have to do, no matter what, whatever it is reducing emissions. It's not canceling them out. It's not buying offsets. All that stuff is super important. Again, I'm kitchen sink. Invest in new technologies we need to scale later. Do all that shit. But we have to reduce them, number one, as fast as possible yesterday, right? And so that's what Drawdown is inherently focused on. But at the same time, it's very, very complicated. If you want sort of the 101 on this stuff, let's start with power, for example. I would really pay attention to folks like Leah Stokes, Dr. Leah Stokes at UC Santa Barbara. She wrote a book called Short Circuiting Policy that helps you understand not only how our entire power generation system works, but all the ways we have failed to enact policy on a state and a federal level to deal with that, and why that's so difficult. Because once you get into the enacting policy part, it's incredibly complicated. You have situations like Texas. And her book came out a year and a half ago, talking about how essentially, the power companies wrote the legislation. And that happens all the time. Turns out that's not great. And that happens in California, and that's happening with natural gas companies everywhere and things like that. You can also read David Roberts at Volts. He used to be at Vox. He's fantastic. He's done a whole, his whole thing is on energy production and transmission. And he's incredibly smart and incredibly readable. To bring that together with Texas and Leah and David and 3x3 solar plant in the desert, totally true. The problem is so if you look at Texas, for example, what really happened is most of their natural gas went down, and you had a couple windmills that froze. Guess what? They didn't have to, because there's stuff running up in the Midwest and in Northern Europe. That's totally fine. So that's ridiculous. One of the biggest problems is, starting with 3x3 thing in the desert, is when we build exclusively centralized power, you are inherently putting a lot of eggs in one basket that anything can happen to, as we saw in Texas. It's easy to be like, well, when is a polar vortex going to happen again? But actually, they had a terrible winter snap 10 years ago, and everybody said, you got to harden that system. Yeah. Man. You got to fix transmission. And they were like, we're deregulated. It's all market driven. We're going to be fine. It wasn't. Clearly, people suffered. People died. People froze. People in the dark. People don't have water. I mean, in Jackson, Mississippi, they're still on a boil water notice. So we should absolutely build huge solar farms and huge offshore and onshore wind farms. But one of the best ways to protect ourselves against accidents or natural disasters or cyber hacking, which is happening. I mean, Florida has had it happening for the past year, is to really decentralize a lot of this stuff as much as we can, which is community solar. It's a metric fuck ton of batteries everywhere in homes, in businesses, again, on the industrial level. for when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing, for emergencies, so that we can run things at the peak level. Look, like you said, solar in most parts of the world is now the cheapest energy we've ever seen. Like, it's incredible. It's blowing away expectations. I think it's ahead of the international energy projections by like 50 to 100 years, which is crazy. That's great. Now we just have to build it out everywhere. We have to make sure it's accessible. We have to make sure that people that have it are able to actually make some money off of it so they can feed it back into the grid.
Yeah.
But that means not just building the solar plant, but completely rebuilding and hardening our transmission everywhere. On a federal level and on a regional level, we've basically got 3 grids. We've got an east grid, a west grid, and the Texas grid. East and west are sort of connected. Texas has sort of declined to be, and that's how that went. Nobody could help them out. You know, when you're disconnected, you're disconnected. But we've also got to do things like, you know, in California, it's okay, if these, you know, power stations are the things that are starting some of these fires that eventually burn towns and cities and lives and homes. What do we do about that? And then you look at it and go, oh, all of California's power lines are above ground. And you run the costs on what it'll take to bury those and go, oh my God, like it's like $1 trillion. It's an absolutely crazy amount of money. But you look at what we just spent dealing with these wildfires and disasters.
Totally.
Right. And this kind of comes to our lizard brains and the difficulties we have for a million reasons in looking forward and planning for the future. And it's really hard, but we're at the point now where we have to do things. These things aren't optional. And that's why I say we have to do the kitchen sink thing. Do we need to suck carbon out of the air? Of course, but we have to get rid of the existing emissions that we're putting out every single day first. We have to stop making the problem. Yes, you want to put dirt back in the hole, but you got to stop digging. You know, like it doesn't matter how much you put back in if you're still digging. So we have to stop that. And of course, you want to do all the other things. And of course, we want to bury the power lines. And of course, we want Texas to not just rely on natural gas, which just explodes all the time. It's entirely unprofitable and has been from the beginning. You know, we have to do all these things, but it's complicated. I wish we could just build the thing in the desert. And we should build the thing in the desert, but we should also put it on everyone's homes. And we should make that a requirement that it's put on all new homes. But then we have to build the pipes to make sure that stuff is going to work in a smart way, in an efficient way, and in a safe way. So it's complicated, but there's incredibly smart people that are working on this. And, you know, sports analogy, like I've been training for this day my entire life. There are power nerds who have been getting ready for this day for 10 years going like, this is what we can do. This is how you retrofit buildings. This is how you retrofit homes. This is how you build these lines. This is how you pass policy in an effective way. We just have to choose to do it, you know, up and down the thing. So it's okay to be optimistic. We can do these things, but it's also important to acknowledge the reality of how difficult it is on a number of levels.
I agree. I think the biggest problem is something that you can't measure. It's a mindset thing, because the last time the United States of America got together with one mission, we were pumping out B-52s like every 4 minutes or something like that.
Yeah.
And we built highways that connected the reason why the North won the Civil War is because we decided to invest in telegrams and train tracks. And it was why we could transport troops back and forth. I say we, I'm a Northerner. Let that one come out, right? But when we really, really put our mind to it, the infrastructure can be done. We've proven that many, many, many times when there's something where as a country, there's like a collective unconscious that says like, this isn't optional. We have to get this done. And that's the part that I believe we're getting there. I think the public lexicon and the conversations that we're having is pretty clear. Even people that maybe traditionally would be right wing, which I don't even know if that necessarily means like I don't believe in climate change, but I think we can correlate it to most of the people that don't believe in climate change or on that side of the aisle, right? And I think even those people are starting to have conversations saying like, one, it's better to do this because it's more profitable. It's more energy efficient. You know, even what you were saying with batteries, one of the cool things about solar is the cells that we're creating now can store this power so well And so it doesn't just constantly burn off. Like you can hold power in batteries. And on top of that, I think we all want to live in a world that isn't polluted. Like pollution is shitty. We love blue skies and green grass and
yeah, I think the hard thing though is, and sorry to interrupt it, is that folks that look like you and me designed a system where a small minority of people and an increasingly small and increasingly powerful minority of people, very much in this country, internationally, but very much in this country, are the only ones with blue skies. It's something like, I'm going to mangle this, but 60 to 70% of folks, black and brown folks in this country, live within a couple miles of a fossil fuel refinery, and that's from systems that are designed around redlining and real estate and insurance. As they say, it's slavery by any other name. And if Congress on the national level is still mostly white lawyers who are men, especially in the Senate, if the Senate is mostly designed, the Senate as it was designed was to, just like the filibuster, was to placate white Southerners. If it remains that way, where they, where if we have, plus the vice president right now, they represent something like 50 million people, then the 49 votes, it's going to be dysfunctional unless we proactively and radically involve inclusive voices that have been, folks like to use the word vulnerable, but they're not vulnerable. They've been marginalized. Like, again, it was designed this way. And if we don't include those perspectives, because they have been dealing with this entire time, and increasingly so, and they know what it feels like on the day-to-day level, then we're just not going to fix it, because those people aren't incentivized to fix it. I mean, you saw, the Republicans who spoke up in the Senate against, hopefully, future Secretary of the Interior, Haaland. It's easy to see how much oil and gas money those folks bring in every year. I mean, we can track all that stuff now. And as long as that is an option, as long as that is happening, they don't care if other people have blue skies and clean air and clean water and clean food. And it's easy to say, well, I'm sure they do. Except again, the receipts are in, and they don't. And, I keep coming back to it, and I don't want to seem like radicalized about this, but I'm getting there, which is, it's like gun control. We had a situation where a school of kindergartners was murdered with assault weapons. And if a country were to ever come together to pass legislation to prevent that from happening again, it would be after a school of kindergartners was shot to death. And it not only did it not happen, but something like 46 of 50 states have looser gun control laws than they do now. And it's similar when you look at climate and when you look at COVID, right? We continue, and by we, I mean the folks that are in power, which again, look like you and me, not implicating you, I'm just saying we have to be transparent, and it's our job now to do everything we can, because the mortality rate among, first of all, the infected rate among Black, Brown, Asian, and Indigenous people was higher because they're living in working conditions. Their hospitalized rate was higher, anywhere from 2 to 4 times higher, because of pre-existing conditions they had. And those are from their living in their working conditions and terrible access to clean food and affordable food and clean and air, affordable water, food deserts, the whole thing. And then they died at a 2 to 4 times higher rate because doctors don't listen to them. And that's in the research, that's been proven. Mostly white doctors don't listen to them. Only 5% of doctors in the US are Black. And because these pre-existing conditions add up, these don't have one morbidity. These people have 2 or 3. And that complication means when a virus comes along that affects the cardiovascular, cardiopulmonary system, they're going to die. And they did. And so that is what's been happening for the past year. And then maybe the greatest scientific achievement of all time is these RMNA or mRNA vaccines, right? And we rolled them out anywhere from 6 to 7 years faster than anyone ever predicted.
It's really incredible.
They're more effective than anything we could have ever predicted. We roll them out, and in the first 3 months, Black and brown people are getting them at a devastatingly lower rate than white folks, despite everything we just watched happen for the past year, which is that these people are infected, hospitalized, and killed 2 to 4 times more than everybody else. And still, we don't prioritize them for giving them the thing that can protect their lives when they're making our food, they're farming our food, they're harvesting our food, they're delivering your food, they're working in the hospitals. We continue, the people who are in charge, continue at every level to choose not to do the right thing for the greater good, to honor that social contract that we theoretically have. And that's the kind of thing that radicalizes not just young people and people of color and indigenous people, but should radicalize people like us who claim to care about those things. Because again, when the receipts are in over and over and over and over, at some point you go, you have to build anew. You don't just build back, you don't do this. You need new people in charge who understand what this is like, who understand what it's like to suffer. Yeah. And we keep making them suffer, and we can do better. And you can be optimistic. We can put people in charge. You know, we can put people like Lauren Underwood in Congress. She's a Black nurse. She's amazing. She's trying to deal with infant and maternal mortality issues, where in Illinois, her home state, Black moms die in pregnancy and after pregnancy at 6 times the rate of white women.
Crazy.
And if it was twice as bad, you would go, that's not great. Twice as bad is real bad, right? Something is amiss. 6 times as bad is when you go, oh, that's a system that's designed to work that way. And so you need to elect a young Black woman who is also a nurse, who can speak all these sides of it, who knows people who's been affected. And that person now gets to be in charge because we fucked it up so bad. And they get to go, this is what has to happen. And we're just at that point where that's what we have to do. It's time to build 3.0.
Yeah, I'm on your side with this for sure. And we're running out of time. I just have one more thing that I wanted to
talk sorry about. To go on tangents about
I'm glad that you did, man. I'm really glad that you did. Like, these are hard conversations to have, and we're friends on Twitter, and I appreciate when I see you just speaking up about things that make people uncomfortable to hear, but is obviously the truth. And that's like important shit, right? And just one of the things that I noticed in this conversation, you said people are suffering maybe like 4 or 5 times. And everything that I brought up from a higher level, like systematic, how do we get to this? It seems like every single time you bring it back down to like, this is affecting individual people. And I wonder where that comes from for you on a personal level. How come some people that can see it from a higher level, systematic, whether it's the solution is free markets, whether the solution is legislation, whatever. And then I think it's so important to remember that we're not just talking about higher level concepts. We're talking about individual families and people. And I totally forget to do that basically every day. I forget that a lot, unless we're talking about addiction, right? Because then that's real to me. And I've done all of that.
That's why you're clean, right?
Yeah. And I've done all of that service work with like individual people who've been strung out on heroin and on the street. And it's like, not just the problem of opiate epidemics, but like you as a person, like, let me help you. So if we could finish this off, and again, take as much time as you want, because I know we're running out of time. Where does that?
I'm doing okay.
Cool. Where does that empathy come from?
You know, man, I feel like a lot of places, but increasingly requires practice. I think it's a lot of things, man. I had the greatest grandparents in the world, and they you know, are the ones who did things like signs like that. Work hard and be nice to people. It's not that hard. I think it's I grew up and you know, 50% of my high school was Black, and a lot of kids were on free lunch. Did I recognize that enough in the moment? No, I mean, of course not. I was a privileged white kid. But a lot of my friends are Black, teen moms, librarians, whatever it might be.
Yeah,
like
I saw that a lot too.
But I clearly, transparently, like, did not do enough to appreciate that and understand that and empathize with that by any stretch. Nowhere close. How much a young kid can, I think, comes a lot down to what they're told to read and how their parents raised them. And my parents did a fantastic job, but yeah, I think that's part of it. I think it's, I've lived the past 11 years in Los Angeles. Homelessness is a true epidemic there. The city and county have done so little to deal with it. There's about 60,000 people on the streets. 6,000 of them are veterans, which should just be a crime where you should be put away forever if you have one person on the street. Where I grew up, where I am now, I'm above a movie theater in Colonial Williamsburg. We're surrounded by military here. One of my best friends is a submarine captain. I think, when you hear about the VA having issues, it's like, not only should these people not be struggling for care, but they should have like sci-fi level fucking care, right? If they're going to make that choice and make that sacrifice for us. That's a different conversation, but I think that's a little part of it. Seeing that he is missed, again, like middle to slightly upper class, like white family, they're fine, but he goes underwater and hides essentially to keep us safe. And that means he's missed most of his kids' youth, right? That's a sacrifice. Live in Los Angeles, you see this all the time. I've lived in London and Spain. I spent time in the Middle East to see that kind of suffering. Again, studying anthropology and sociology and religion and stuff, and seeing how people live with a lot less than we do here, and they're okay. And at the same time, we make it seem very difficult here when it shouldn't be for folks that look like us. And I also think it's exposing yourself to these things proactively, which is something that folks like you and me have to do, because it's very easy to be in this bubble and not do it, even if you're not consciously doing it. And then not only exposing yourself doing it, but what's all the talking on Twitter for nerds like us, right? Building in public. Like, you have to build yourself in public. And for white guys, it's not just like how much you write every day or your podcast or your growth numbers or whatever. It's saying like, I am benefiting from a system that is designed to look, but from people like me for 400 years. And that's why I get to sit here and write blog posts every day. That's crazy. This whole important, not important thing is nowhere near profitable. But I can bootstrap it because I have this screenwriting life, and because my wife is incredibly supportive and works so hard and is so talented and so great. And I can do that. There's so many people that can't do that. Yeah, you can start a blog for free, but most people can't find the time to do that. Sure. My kids go to one of the very few good public schools in Los Angeles. Most of them are awful because we spend half as much per student as New York does. Very few good public schools. There's 1,000 kids at the school from K to 5, and still most of them are on free lunch. A number of them are straight up homeless. There's no school nurse, and the parents pay for every one of the enrichment, art, music, gym, dance, whatever it might be. Wow. And that's in one of the few good ones, right? There's 700,000 students in that school district. And so you have to proact. If you are not exposed to this, if this isn't your life, you have to proactively put yourself there and read the hard things and go into soup kitchens or volunteer, whatever it might be, look at the statistics and go do the real math on it. Like 6 times Black women are dying than white women. Go like, do the math on that. Like, why is it is the 21st century? And like, you're going to find out, like you said, your wife said a hard but not catastrophic pregnancy. That's rough. Pregnancy is wild, man. Birth is wild. Like, we've been doing it for a few 100,000 years and it's still fucking hard. We got all these tools and doctors and all this stuff. It's crazy. We had some hard ones. We had massive infertility issues. We were incredibly privileged to be able to afford to make our way through those, thankfully to science. But at the same time, most people can't afford to do that. And then they still die at 6 times the rate. You still see these incredibly brave and transparent things published by Beyonce and Serena Williams. Incredibly smart, driven, profoundly wealthy, know their bodies probably better than you and I ever could, despite how many athletes. You think somebody knows their body better than Serena Williams? You're fucking wrong, right? Mm-hmm. And yet she was sitting on the floor of the bathroom in her hospital room, bleeding out because the doctor didn't believe her about what's happening with her body. Like, if that's happening to her, what about all these other women that they don't listen to, because 5% of doctors are Black and the rest just don't listen. And if you don't proactively expose yourself and take part in it, and something, we've tried to do with the podcast, and I'm getting ready to, on bandwidth level, transparently share this stuff as much as we can. Like, 60% of our guests are women, 75% of our guests are either women and or people of color. And that can be so much better. And we're trying to make it better. But if you don't sit there and just fucking listen and start off the conversation for however many listeners you have saying, if you're new here, I want to be clear, I'm having this conversation from the perspective of a privileged white man, and I'm here to listen. And we position it as a conversation, not an interview, because I want to be able to step in and say, this is my experience and this is how it conflates with that. Tell me how I can do better and how I can take action to move that thing. Because it doesn't matter if you just sit there and listen. You got to do something about it. And it matters. If we built this thing, then we have to help make it better. And, despite how many of these incredible voices have been elevated and have had a spotlight on them, they're still not the people in charge. And that continues to be the case because it's a flywheel that just reinforces itself until we break it. And I'm happy to break that as much as I can, because it's just, I don't know, man, maybe it's having kids, feeling lucky that I was able to have the kids I had, that I have. I haven't kicked them out yet. But, we did this interview with a woman, Beena Venkataraman, she's an author of a book called The Optimist Telescope, which you would love. She's also now the editor for the opinions page of the Boston Globe. Incredibly smart. And she had this quote in her book that really focused some things for me, and that maybe were floating around the ether before. And it's essentially, she asks herself over and over, how do I be a better ancestor?
Wow.
And that's really specific, right? And I said, oh, that's great. And she's like, look, I don't have kids. I'm not having kids, but I've got nieces and nephews and things like that. And I look to them and go, how can I help them right now and set them up for the future? Because brown kids that look like her in this country haven't had the greatest experience. But what can she do? Because somehow through incredible hard work and intelligence and creativity, she's risen to a place where she can start to move that needle. But she needs guys like us to do 6x the work, right? Totally. And if you can frame it that way and go, how do I be a better ancestor? I can look at my privileged little white kids and go, look, man, am I doing everything I can? Of course not. I mean, very few people do, and those people are saints and incredible, or they have to. But I'm trying to do a lot, and I'm trying to do more, and I'm trying to fix things now. And so that my kids go, boy, I got some fucking shoes to fill. I got to do better. And this is, one of those climate change things, people go, oh, how can you have kids, climate change, this and this? It's like, because it's very clear to my kids that they need to be part of the answer. Yeah. Like, they don't get to just ride the ride, man. I make it obnoxiously clear every single day. And I hope with my writing and our conversations that I'm leaving that if I get kicked off the planet today. But it's that, I think some of it is also having lost. I mean, my best friend died 10 years ago from cancer out of nowhere. And it makes you realize, again, things putting in focus very quickly, like, oh, this whole thing is real short.
Real short.
And it can get taken away real fast. I mean, he got a cancer that's usually seen in over 65 Black men who smoked their whole life. And he was like a 30-year-old college soccer player who ran marathons. And we drank and had fun, but he didn't do any of that stuff. He was gone in 3 months. And you go, you were saying, right? You want to be optimistic, but it's easy to put your head in the sand and go like, whatever happens, happens. And I had this great conversation with a very good friend afterwards. And I always remember it because I immediately became, like you were saying with addiction and leaving a clean life, I immediately was like, oh, if that can happen to him, get this cancer that he shouldn't have, then I need to go even further and I need to live like the cleanest life I possibly can, right? Much to my wife's chagrin. I'm very annoying about it, right? No meat, no dairy. I barely drank this and that. I exercise all the time. It's so obnoxious. And at the same time, my friend goes, and he's the greatest. He goes, but if that could happen to him and it was out of his control, why not just live, man?
Yeah.
And you're like, yeah, there's a fucking argument for that for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But whether it's my complete fear of death that my poor therapist has to hear about every 2 weeks, or not wanting to leave so early, or whatever it is, I just feel this need to do as much as I can, so that I don't feel hungover every day, because I've been there. But also just to do as much as I can. And if people are suffering at 2x, 3x, 4x, 5x, 6x, that's table stakes for you and me, you know? And I'm not going to really judge you if you don't go up to that level, but you got to do something, man, you know? And, you know, that's just, again, it's not just the right thing to do now. It's not just feel good. Like, clock's ticking. Everything's on fire. There's a great quote on Twitter. Somebody 6 months ago in the middle of this thing said, it was in California when everything was on fire. And they said something along the lines of, can't breathe inside, can't breathe outside. You know, like our pets' heads are falling off. And you're like, yeah, that's when you got to look around and go like, we got to start over, man.
Yeah.
Like, this is not going well. And this is the beginning of all that shit. So I don't know, man. I guess it's all those things and just trying to be. It's reading old stuff. Like, it's so easy with all the content online and great creators that are out there, and they're amazing. But you can learn so much by reading old books. People have had it the whole time, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, you know? Yeah, you can learn a lot from that and then just try to apply it. I mean, people who are, you know, incredibly smart and empathetic and full of wisdom, but they don't have satellites that can watch like methane things explode. And then someone says it on Twitter 10 seconds later and we attack that company and destroy their public value. Like, that shit is like 6 months old, but somehow you can still learn how to think and how to conduct yourself from folks like that who have seen shit, you know, and helpful to do it from perspectives that aren't yours.
Man, I really appreciate
it.
Quinn. Well, that's vulnerable. You have something driving you and you can't quite put your finger on it, but there's something driving you. And I really appreciate that. We've talked a little bit in the past just about how I could be a little bit more involved with what you're doing. You know, obviously my wife.
But you're doing really cool healthcare stuff, man. What made you build this whole healthcare business?
Exactly what you said. There's 20 million people that need treatment for addiction, and maybe about 5% of them are eligible for it simply because the healthcare model. This is why some of the free market stuff is important to me, because in order to actually have a treatment system, you have to talk about money. And when people say things like, what do you mean? How are you going to profit off of helping people? It's like, okay, what about the counselors that spend $60,000 to learn how to be a counselor? You know, what about the operations people that have to come to work every day and figure out how the billing cycles work? And what about the software you need to keep track of when this person is going where within their treatment cycle, you know? So there's this two juxtapositions of the conversation that says like, you're helping people, you shouldn't worry about profit. And then there's the other side that says like, okay, but what about the people that need to be qualified to do this work? Like, you got to pay them. That's just how life is. And so when I was looking at the financial incentives of treatment, it was just so clear to me that it's set up backwards, where if you put the incentives, it's almost like the prison system and the VA system a little bit. I think treatment, VA, and prison are all very, very similar, where if the incentive isn't for like prison guard unions to stay in labor, or for treatment centers to continue to cherry pick these really high profitable insurance companies in like Southern Jersey, you know what I mean? If the actual incentive is 6 months from now, are they still clean? 6 months from now, are they still out of prison? You know, like 6 months from now, are they healthier mentally than they were? Then people would work in different ways. And so when I just saw this, I thought to myself, this is silly. In-network models make so much more sense from a financial incentive. And it just didn't make any sense to me that there's 20 million people. And when you see your friends overdosing in front of you, you know what I mean? Like, I grew up in Philly. The heroin problem there is really, really terrible. Friends dying in like bathrooms, right? Like, you go out to breakfast and then your friend goes to the bathroom, right? And this is the typical thing, like, let me go in the bathroom and shoot up. And it just sticks with you, you know? And so I can't be an evangelist. Like, I don't have any desire to just serve the world for free all the time and like just sacrifice myself. I want things. And I think, and ultimately, here's what I came up with. What could possibly be better than creating something that helps other people, helps provide employment for people, helps provide employment and financial stability for myself, and like does good in the world. It's always funny to me that when oil execs make a ton of money, nobody thinks, everyone's like, that's like the standard. Like, oh yeah, you're supposed to make a ton of money. But if you're building a business that's generated to actually help people, the conversation is different, where it's like, oh, there shouldn't be financial incentive there. Where for me, it's exactly the opposite. Like there should be financial incentive to help people, and there shouldn't be financial incentive with what we talked about with operations that create externalities. So I think about this shit too much. I sit up at night a lot. I don't sleep a whole lot. I've always just had like a ton of fucking energy, and I talk really fast.
Welcome.
Yeah. And so the more and more I think about this, I'm just like, this is backwards. It should be the other way. Like the financial incentive for prison system should be keep people out of prison. The financial incentives for treatment should be keep people out of treatment. But it's opposite. So I just think,
well, and that's why you hear a lot of, and that's really thoughtful. And again, I'm not trying to get rid of capitalism. I mean, I had a whole discussion with Professor Rebecca Henderson at Harvard she wrote a great book called Rebuilding Capitalism in a World on Fire. And it's tremendous. And we had a really great talk about, everything from, you got to rebuild the business from the inside out. You can't just hire diverse or inclusive people. You have to fucking listen to them and let them set the tone and tell them what you should be working on and what they want to work on and all that stuff. And then apply that to your industry, and then apply that to the market, apply that to the world. Like, you can do these things, and business has to lead the way, because government has been a disaster, because it's been pillaged for 40 years. And because we passed tax cuts without paying for them, without helping people, yada, 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 all this stuff. But there's ways to do it. Like, we're really good at business in a fucked up way, but that can be used, you know? And, you hear, good friend I've come to know, is a gentleman named Jay Scott. He runs an organization called Alex's Lemonade Stand. He's co-executive director with his wife, Liz. They're out of Philly.
Yeah.
So Jay and Liz's daughter, Alex, got cancer when she was 9, and she died. And before she died, while she was getting treatment, she started a lemonade stand to raise money to pay for other kids to get treatment while she had cancer. And you're like, Jesus Christ. I mean, like, what am I doing? And they had this decision, which to me, either way these people go, you go with what you got, man. They had to decide, our daughter just died. Do we support her dream and keep working with this and make ourselves close to kids who are suffering from cancer every day? Or do we make a clean break? Because we don't want to suffer that way. And when a kid dies, as far as I'm concerned, you get to do whatever you want, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And they decided to build this organization, and she died 20 years ago. And they raise all this incredible money, and it mostly goes to 2 places. It goes to research, and it goes to travel costs for families who can't afford it for some of these groundbreaking research things.
Yeah.
Say somebody's coming to Cedars, or someone's going to Sloan Kettering, but it's a family in South Carolina, and both they need to get there tomorrow, and they can't afford the flight and the hotel because it's a stay. And what do you do with the family or the parent who's going with them? And Jay gets calls and the doctor goes like, I got to get this guy here. Can you help? And he goes, that's, what we're here for. And it's hard and it's terrible. But, one of the things he always says is like, I want to put us out of business. That's the incentive.
Yeah.
If there's anything that shouldn't fucking exist in the world, it's the words like kids cancer. Like, come on. And he knows personally, he's like, I want it out of here. I don't want to do this, and that's so powerful, and that's where it should be. And we can design those things. I mean, you read, like you said, the prison system. You can't read, Dr. Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, and not go, Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Like, this has to be 1,000% better, because the layers, again, it's a system that it's not broken. It was designed this way. When you have things like, we put prisons in white districts because in the census, we count prisoners. And so that gives white districts more voting power, but we don't help the districts where they came from, so they get less power. And you're like, oh, it's just a flywheel of really just like burying these people forever and ever and ever since we stopped Reconstruction. But there has to be incentives, like you said, that are based on recidivism, that are based on treatment, that are based on not coming back,
Exactly.
And there's ways we can do that. And but we also at the same time have to look at it. And when you look at these families that overprescribed, that benefited from opioids being prescribed for 4 years.
The Sacklers made like $40 billion or something.
You should go to jail forever.
Yeah.
Forever. Or Martin Shakir, whatever that guy's fucking name is, you're just like, goodbye. You're done, and we have to both penalize those people to the harshest degree, but also make it so that cannot happen. Mm-hmm. Like that is not okay. But there are ways to build these things so that they work and so they make sense. I mean, Important Not Important is not a charity. I didn't design it to be that way. It doesn't make any fucking money, but that hasn't been my point. My point has been to put out the best thing I can to make impact. But it's not a charity for a number of reasons. My wife and I contribute at least 10% of our income to highly effective organizations to help people that don't look like us. But at the same time, I think I can do some good with it not being a charity, while also using the money from it to fund things that do better work. Because, one of the conversations my wife and I had early when I became very invested in all these things, metaphorically and fiscally, was, why don't you just go work for one of those things? And get in there. And it's an interesting thought and conversation. And there's a lot of people who go like, yeah, I'm going to go do that. I'm going to go make it my work. But I think I can have more of an impact in a generalist way, affecting more of those places and letting the people who are really good at that work do that work. Because I'm not that person, and I'll never be as talented as Emmett raising money, which is what they spend so much time doing, or how specifically they do it. When my friend died and before, when he got cancer, and my young cousin before that who survived got cancer, I looked around and I said, not a scientist, terrible flashcards, not a doctor, same problem, like just did a terrible job at AP Bio, not a journalist, like what is the thing I can do? And you'll appreciate this because we talk about going to church. I was like, oh, I can sweat. Like this is,
for sure.
There's one thing this body is capable of, and I can do that. And my cousin had leukemia, and there's an organization called the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, and they have a fundraising arm called the Team in Training, and it's been around for 25 years, and it's incredible. And you, in your locale, I can't encourage someone to do it enough. You sign up and you train with a team. I mean, once we get out of this whole shithole, you train with the team. There's programs. You work out with them, and you have talks, and there's groups and all this thing, and then you run in the gear, and people are cheering on the sidelines going, team in training, I survived lymphoma, and you're just like crying the whole time. But you're doing the thing you can do, right? And this is the biggest question and the most prolific question we get with climate or whatever it might be, especially COVID this year, which is, it's really hard to be told, like, just stay inside. That's the thing you can do. Because you can do that or choose not to, but it's hard to feel like you're making a difference. And it's hard when you face sea level rise or urban heat or wildfires to go like, what do I do? And so people go like, what can I do, man? And the best answer is, Tim, what can you do?
Yeah, whatever you can do.
And because everybody, has a Liam Neeson, like very specific set of skills. Mm-hmm. And whether it's art or design or writing or legislation or being an attorney or running a company or fundraising, you can just sweet talk people out of checks. Great, we'll take it. Whatever the thing is, make movies, documentaries, you can do everything. You'd be a nurse. And we need all of it. And you can do that, and this seems to be the thing where I can be most effective for now, at least.
Yeah.
So like you said, we have to design these things so that they can work and so they can make a difference, because we have to measure them in impact. We have to bring those numbers down.
Yeah.
So.
Well, that's real powerful, man. I'm going to take a couple hours after this and just think about how I can get more involved. I know we've talked about it before. I think about it a lot. I always tell myself, like, focus on the addiction stuff. That's where I can be most helpful. But at the same time, I just have a calling to also be involved with nature and climate. So we can talk after this. Man,
absolutely, man. But don't discount what you're doing. I mean,
totally.
You can look at it as like most people aren't doing much, but like, this so well.
Yeah.
From your own experiences personally and watching friends and family and where you're from and this and because of the news we've seen. And you're a technical nerd, so you can apply some skills to that. You can build it from SEO front. And that's a specific thing that like nobody had done yet. So one of my best friends works for a research hospital in Southwestern Virginia. And that's where people are heavier, they smoke, they don't take their medicine, all three of those things, fucking nightmare. And because of that, and this is, I mean, the entire US health system, this is a huge issue, is people come to the emergency room instead of going to the doctor,
Exactly.
right? And it's a nightmare for 1,000 different reasons. And his entire job is he's a data nerd, and he's trying to figure out how to get people to stop coming to the fucking emergency room, to go to the doctor, to take their medicine, which also makes healthcare costs come way down. And that's something he can specifically do because of where he is, because of how his brain works. And like, no one had really been working on that there as much as they're doing all this cool research and helping people and all that. This is a specific problem that he's like focused on. And like with your healthcare stuff and doing like SEO for business, it's like, look at the way telehealth has exploded and all these things we've realized we've needed in the past year, right? They need help, like exactly the kind of things you're doing. And that's amazing because no one's doing that.
Yeah, it's really cool that you bring that up. One of the projects I've been working on for the last year and a half is one of the reasons why in-network policies have a hard time getting people into treatment is because a lot of blue collar jobs like factories, especially, I live in Nashville and we had to deal with a lot of the car factories around here, and it's difficult for them to train employees. And I actually got to head out of here, but let me tell you this story.
Yeah, please.
It's difficult for them to train employees. So when they lose an employee to treatment, one of the biggest problems is that they go to the ER 3 or 4 times. And since they're in-network benefits, it jacks up their insurance rates. And so again, it's just this constant cycle of like, we need to keep the employee because paying to train another one is hard. But every time we keep this employee, it's even harder because it jacks up our insurance rates. And so we worked really, really hard on creating these contracts, in-network contracts, basically, that are incentivized by if somebody comes through this treatment program, it's bi-weekly monitoring with the whole intention of 2 things: keeping them employed so that they pay federal income tax and keeping them out of the ER. And it's like those 2 things, those 2 very, very specific incentive points, like we talked about before, will completely change the insurance billing problem with treatment. That's all you got to do. Keep them. And this is cool because then you're not even talking about weird subjective things like keeping them sober, because that could mean something different to everybody. But if somebody goes through treatment and you focus on 2 things, making sure they have a job, which means they pay federal income tax insurance, and stay out of the ER, those 2 things alone will like solve this huge financial implosion that we've had with addiction treatment. So I agree, man. Find something specific you can do. Find however you can be helpful. And I think it's so cool, man. I'm like really grateful you're a person, Quinn. I appreciate all your work.
Please tell my wife that.
I will.
No, man, I appreciate the conversation. It's sorry to go on and on and on and on.
That's important. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
I believe in being forthright and transparent about it. So, and again, on my shows, I probably do talk too much. The goal is to let the guest talk. So it's nice to talk about the business.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate it, man.
Thanks for what you're doing. I'm so shamed by your room. I have so much work to do here. I mean, it's like, it's so classy, like the guitar that's propped up, and I've like barely got a movie.
I worked hard on it, man. I said, well, fuck it. If this is like my new space station and 2020 is all through here, I was like, I need a 6 space stations. So yeah, your compliment does not go unrecognized.
I could be like in a hostage situation anywhere, really. Yeah. Well, thank you, man, for the time. This has been awesome. You're doing a great job, dude.
Thanks, brother.
Yeah, let me know what else.
All right, man. Keep in touch.
All right, buddy. Take care. See ya.